Elara Voss had not expected to be here. She was 23, and the palace did not quite know what to do with her. Her father had served the crown for 19 years as its royal translator of Valdennian. He had died in the January just past, leaving her 2 debts, a rented room in the lower city, and one ink-stained dictionary whose spine was held together by a strip of linen she had cut from an old petticoat. The dictionary sat open on her desk now, its pages soft with use. She consulted it without thinking, the way one consults a familiar face. The antechamber assigned to her was unheated. The palace had grander rooms, she knew, with fires that burned through the night and curtains thick enough to hold warmth like a cupped hand. This room had neither. Her breath moved in small pale clouds above the document she was rendering. The letter was a diplomatic correspondence from the Valdennian foreign minister, addressed to the King's Council in formal court French, and she was working through it line by careful line. She dipped her pen. The ink was slow in the cold. She dipped it again and waited. Outside in the corridor, footsteps clicked against the stone, a measured, unhurried sound. A court lady appeared in the open doorway. She wore green velvet with cream gloves, and her hair was dressed in the fashion that the season had decided upon. She glanced into the antechamber. Her gaze moved across Elara's desk, across the dictionary, across the dove-grey wool of Elara's dress, with its mended hem at the left sleeve, and she looked away. She did not slow her step. The footsteps continued down the corridor and faded. Elara watched the empty doorway for a moment, then she looked back at the letter. It was not unkindness, precisely. It was something quieter than that. It was the particular invisibility of being useful, but unremarkable, of occupying a room that no one had quite decided to give you. She had grown familiar with it in these 6 months since her father's death. 6 months prior, the Lord Chamberlain had dissolved her father's post within a fortnight of his passing. She had understood. Posts did not belong to families. They belonged to the crown. What she had not understood was the summons that arrived 3 weeks later, written in the Chamberlain's own precise hand, informing her that her presence was required at the palace for a period of temporary translation work. She had come. She had brought the dictionary, she had been given this cold room, this desk, and a succession of documents whose urgency was never explained to her. She was retained for now. That was the phrase that had been used. She had not yet been told what now meant or how long it would last. The diplomatic letter before her mentioned a proposed trade agreement. It mentioned quantities of Valdennian timber and a figure, she rendered it carefully, of 43,000 guineas. She moved her pen steadily. Near the bottom of the page, half hidden among the formal courtesies, she noticed the royal seal pressed into the corner of the original document. It was the king's own seal, not the council's. She had transcribed dozens of documents in this room. She had not seen the king's seal before. She set her pen down. The fire she did not have would have crackled had it existed. The cold pressed against the window glass and made small sounds. She looked at the seal for a long moment and felt the question rise in her as quietly as her own breath rose and dissolved in the air. Why had she been summoned at all? Her father's gift had been Valdennian, a language spoken by fewer than 60,000 people across a small northern principality, and hardly useful beyond a narrow range of diplomatic correspondence. She had learned it at his side in his study, beginning at the age of 7, and she had learned it well. But the palace had managed without a translator for 6 months. It had not seemed to suffer. She returned to the letter. She was nearly finished. The chamberlain would come for it before the afternoon bell, and she would hand it to him, and he would tuck it under his arm without comment, and she would begin the next document in the stack. She heard his footsteps now. She had learned to distinguish them from the court ladies, from the guards, from the various unhurried gaits of people who belonged here, easily. He appeared in the doorway. He was a tall man of perhaps 60, precise in his dress, with the expression of someone who had answered questions for a very long time and found the habit tiring. She lifted the finished pages and held them toward him. He stepped in and took them. "My Lord Chamberlain," she said, and kept her voice even, "I wonder if you might tell me whether my position here is confirmed." He looked at the pages rather than at her. He shuffled them once, neatening the edges. "You are retained for now, Miss Voss," he said. He left. The cold settled back around her. She opened the dictionary to the next document's first unfamiliar word, and the room held its quiet, like a promise not yet made. The Eastern Gallery Library held the particular cold of a room that had been grand for too long. Tall grey windows ran the length of the north wall, and February light came through them without warmth, falling in pale rectangles across the beeswax-polished parquet and the ranked spines of 1,000 volumes that no one had opened in months. Elara had been given leave to use the gallery on Tuesday mornings when the court was occupied elsewhere, and she was grateful for it in the quiet, practical way she had learned to be grateful for small permissions. She carried her father's Valdennian dictionary under one arm, its linen-mended spine pressed against her grey wool sleeve, and she was returning a folio of maritime charts to the upper shelf when she heard a step behind her that belonged to no servant she knew. Servants moved with purpose or with haste. This step was unhurried in a different way, not leisurely, not careless, but belonging to a man who had ceased to require the opinion of rooms. She turned just enough to look. Prince Aldrich of the House Corvinay, 31 years old and 2 years a widower, was crossing the gallery alone. No equerry, no attendant, no one at his shoulder to receive the look he did not wish to bestow. He wore a plain dark coat, unadorned except for a single mourning button still sewn at the cuff, and he moved as though the long room were simply a passage between one thought and the next. Elara stepped aside and dipped her head in the manner appropriate to a translator's daughter encountering a sovereign prince in an empty corridor, low enough to be correct, quick enough not to impede. She expected him to pass. He stopped, not with the arrested motion of a man who has decided to speak, but with the motion of a man who has noticed something he did not anticipate. His gaze had gone, not to her face, but to the dictionary beneath her arm. She held herself still, the cold from the windows pressed against her back. The beeswax smell of the parquet rose faintly between them. He said, without preamble, "Which edition is that?" His voice was even, without inflection designed to put her at ease or to remind her of the distance between them. It was simply a question. Elara looked down at the volume as though confirming what she already knew. "The Havelmark Third," she said, 1809. The second appendix corrects the tidal glossary, but the marginal notes in the earlier editions are better. He regarded the spine for a moment. "My father owned a copy," he said. The binding gave out. He had it resewn in brown calf. "Mine is linen," she said. It was what we had. There was a pause in which neither of them moved. The gallery held its breath around them, or seemed to. Then he said, "Which passage were you consulting?" She had not expected that question, and because she had not expected it, she answered it truthfully, rather than carefully. "Valundra," she said. "It sits between the entry for Vel, for sail, and Undrath, which is a kind of coastal fog. Most translators render it as longing, but the word carries a directional quality that longing does not. It is a longing that knows where it is pointed, even when the thing longed for cannot be reached." Prince Aldrich was quiet for a moment that lasted longer than she had counted on. He was not looking at the dictionary now. He was looking at some middle distance between himself and the grey window light, and his expression had not changed. Precisely, but something behind it had shifted in the way that weight shifts when it settles deeper into a foundation rather than lifting from one. "There is no equivalent," he said, not as a question. "None that I have found," she said. "I have been trying for 6 months." He inclined his head. Then, not the abbreviated nod of dismissal she had seen him give ministers in the corridor beyond, but something slightly slower, as though the motion cost him the small effort of deliberateness, and he walked on. His step did not change. He passed the end of the shelving case, turned at the far window, and was gone through the side door before she had quite recovered herself enough to turn back to the folio she had been returning. She stood at the shelving case for a moment, her hand still raised toward the upper shelf, the dictionary warm under her arm from being held close. The gallery was exactly as it had been, cold windows, pale light, beeswax, the ranked and patient spines. Nothing had been said that required remembering, nothing had been promised or implied, and yet the room felt altered in the way that a room feels altered after a candle is brought in and then removed. Not darker, exactly, but more aware of its own dimensions. She set the folio in its place, straightened it with one finger along the spine, and stood a moment longer before she went back to her work. The great dining hall held 300 candles that evening, and Elara had counted them without meaning to, a habit of mind that kept her steady when her hands wished to tremble. She sat below the salt, as was fitting for a hired interpreter, between the grey-bearded Valdennian envoy and his young aide, whose fingers were perpetually dark with ink. The borrowed ivory gown lay smooth across her lap. She had pressed the mended hem herself that afternoon with a cold iron and a great deal of patience, and it did not show, not unless one looked very closely, and no one at that table was looking at her hem. They were looking at the roasted pheasant and at Lady Vanthorpe, which was, Elara supposed, the natural order of a court dinner. She did not mind being overlooked. It was, in its way, a kind of shelter. The envoy leaned toward her and spoke in a low, measured Valdennian that carried the particular gravity of old men who have learned the cost of imprecision. She rendered his words into clear, unhurried Aldorian, her voice barely above the candlelight, and the minister across the table nodded and replied, and she carried the reply back across the invisible border of language as though she were simply passing a letter from one hand to another. She did not editorialize, she did not soften, she translated and the conversation moved, and she was necessary in the way that a door hinge is necessary, utterly without ornament, and quietly essential. Lady Vanthorpe sat 3 places higher on the same side of the table, and her deep rose silk caught the candlelight with a particular sullenness, as though even the flames admired her, and she found the attention merely adequate. She had been speaking with her companion in the low, carrying tone that well-born women sometimes employ when they wish to be overheard without appearing to intend it. Elara was mid-sentence, rendering the envoy's observation about tariff agreements, when the words arrived at her ear with the casual precision of a well-thrown stone. "A tradesman's daughter," Lady Vanthorpe said, "playing at letters. How very quaint." Her companion offered a small, decorative laugh, the kind that requires no humour to produce. Elara did not turn. She did not pause. She finished the sentence she had begun. The tariff on Eastern wool, she said, had been a matter of some dispute since the reign of the previous king, and she moved on to the next sentence, and the minister nodded again, and the dinner continued. Her hands, folded in her lap, between passages, tightened once against each other. That was all. The envoy noticed nothing. The minister noticed nothing. The candles burned on without comment, which she found she appreciated in them. The aide, whose name was Tibor, and who had the watchful, earnest look of a young man who reads more than he sleeps, glanced at her from across his untouched soup. He had been quiet throughout the meal, taking small notes in a leather-bound book that he kept half-concealed beside his plate, but now he set the pen down and leaned a degree closer. "Miss Voss," he said, in careful, accented Old Dorian, "do you find the court here kind?" It was a genuine question. She could hear the sincerity in it, the slight hesitation before the word kind, as though he had considered several other words and set them aside. She looked at him for a moment. He had earnest grey eyes and an ink stain along the outer edge of his left hand that reached almost to the wrist. She thought he probably understood more of the evening than he had let on. "Instructive," she said, with a careful smile. He considered this for a moment as a scholar considers a text that contains more than its first reading yields. Then he nodded slowly and wrote something in his small book, and they returned to the work of the table without elaborating further, and she thought that was perhaps the most honest exchange she had had at court in a fortnight. Later, after the company had dispersed to their various amusements, she passed through the cold eastern corridor alone, her footsteps quiet on the stone. A long mirror panel stood between 2 unlit sconces, and she paused before it without quite intending to. The candlelight from the hall behind her reached far enough to illuminate the glass, and she looked at herself for a moment. The ivory gown, the composed face, the hem, invisible at that distance. She reached down and smoothed the fabric at her hip, not from anxiety, but from a kind of deliberate attention. She had pressed that hem. It held. Whatever Lady Vanthorpe had intended to diminish was still, at this hour, entirely intact. She straightened, drew a slow breath of cold corridor air, and walked on toward her room, carrying herself as she always did, with the quiet dignity of someone who has decided on the matter of her own worth not to refer the question to anyone else. The antechamber was cold when Elara arrived that morning. Frost had crept to the inner sill in the night, and the candle she lit threw more shadow than warmth across the table. She set down her satchel, unwound her scarf, and then she stopped. A slim volume rested atop her correspondence papers. It had not been there the evening before. She was certain of that. The binding was dark blue, worn soft at the corners as though it had been read many times in another life. No note accompanied it, no ribbon, no wax seal, no name. She stood for a moment without touching it, as though touching it might dissolve whatever had placed it there. The palace moved around her. A footstep in the corridor, the distant clatter of a grate being raked, and she remained still. At last, she lifted the book and opened it. The title page declared itself in Valdennian, a collection of court verses from the previous century, the kind of poetry that spoke of winter fields and waiting and the particular silence of a closed door. She turned the pages slowly, reading a line here, a phrase there. The language was formal, slightly archaic even by Valdennian standards, and she felt her scholar's mind settle into it the way one settles into a familiar chair. Then she found it. Near the middle of the volume, beside a verse about the long pause between one season and the next, a single word had been underlined in pencil. The stroke was faint, almost tentative, as if the hand that made it had second-guessed itself part-way through. The word was the Valdennian term for longing, the very word she and Prince Aldrich had spoken of in the gallery library, the one for which her own language offered no true equivalent, and in the margin beside it, in the same light hand, someone had drawn a question mark. Nothing else. She read the verse 3 times. Then she closed the book and held it in her lap, and looked at the frost on the sill for a long while. The question mark was not a question about the word. She understood that. It was something quieter, something turned inward, as if whoever had placed it there was asking not what the word meant, but whether the feeling itself was permitted. She did not begin her correspondence for some time. The afternoon came grey and still. She had moved the poetry volume to the edge of the table, not hidden, not displayed, simply present, as one keeps a thing one has not yet decided how to hold. It was then that she heard footsteps in the corridor, measured, unhurried, a man's tread she had learned by now to distinguish from the lighter step of the Chamberlain's pages. She did not look up immediately. When she did, Prince Aldrich was passing her open doorway. He did not pause. He did not slow his step or turn his head with any deliberateness. But for one brief moment his gaze moved to hers across the threshold, and hers to his. And in that small exchange something passed that neither of them named. He was gone before she might have spoken, and she did not call after him. She would not have known what to call. She looked back at the table. The blue volume sat where she had placed it, unhurried and patient, its penciled question mark waiting inside like a pressed flower. It was late in the afternoon when Marta came with a mended cuff Elara had left with her the previous week. The older woman set the garment on the chair, smoothed it once with a practised hand, and then her eye fell on the poetry book. She tilted her head the way she did when she had already formed an opinion and was only waiting for someone to invite it. "Where did that come from?" she asked, her voice easy, unbothered, the tone of a woman who has seen most things twice. Elara considered the question honestly. "I cannot say with certainty," she said. Marta was quiet for a moment. "Cannot," she said at last, "or will not." Elara did not answer, and Marta did not press her. She patted the mended cuff once more and left without ceremony, her footsteps fading down the corridor in the direction of the sewing room. The candle had burned low, Outside, the frost-rimed garden was losing its shape to the early dusk, the hedges becoming shadows, the gravel path disappearing into grey. Elara opened the poetry book again to the underlined word, read it once and then closed it gently and set it beneath her satchel, out of sight but close, the way one keeps a question one is not yet ready to answer. The archive room held its breath in winter. Frost pressed against the high casement windows, and the candles on the long table burned with a particular steadiness of flames that have nothing left to resist. Elara had come to know this room well. Its smell of beeswax and old leather, its shelves ranked with correspondence bound in faded ribbon, its quality of silence that was not emptiness, but patience. She had not expected company. The Lord Chamberlain's notice arrived that morning, precise and without sentiment. The prince required a translator to assist with his late father's diplomatic papers. She was assigned. She arrived at the first hour of the afternoon to find Prince Aldrich already seated, a folio open before him, his coat dark against the pale disorder of documents he had drawn from their boxes. He did not look up immediately. She took her place at the opposite end of the table and waited, as a translator waits, present, quiet, ready. The work began without ceremony. He passed pages to her. She rendered passages from Valdennian into the plain court tongue, reading softly so as not to disturb the room's composure. He listened. She noticed that he listened with his whole attention, not with the half-attention of men accustomed to being served. An hour passed in this manner, then two. The candles shortened. At some point, she could not have named the precise moment, they ceased to sit at opposite ends of the table and came instead to work side by side, the better to share the pages. She was aware of the proximity without letting herself dwell on it. He read one passage aloud, slowly, as though testing the weight of each word. His father had written it to a minor sovereign 30 years prior, a letter about the burdens of treaty-keeping, about the weariness of maintaining peace across languages neither party shared natively. Duty, the old king had written, sits heavier than a crown. Aldrich set the page down. He said, without looking at her, that he wondered what she made of it. The question surprised her. She was accustomed to being asked what words meant, not what words signified. She considered the page for a moment, then she said that his father had written with more honesty than diplomacy customarily permitted, that perhaps the letter had been written for himself as much as for its recipient. That exhaustion, when a man cannot speak it plainly, will find its way into the margins of formal things. Aldrich did not reply at once. He turned the page over in his hands. He said, quietly, that he thought she might be right. They returned to their work. Later in the afternoon she found it, a drafting error in a treaty drawn up a decade prior. A single Valdennian pronoun rendered ambiguously, which had altered the apparent intent of an entire clause. No one had marked it. The original and the copy both carried the mistake, each one faithfully reproducing the other's confusion. She brought it to his attention without flourish, simply setting the 2 pages before him and indicating the passage. He read carefully. He looked at her then, not with surprise but with recognition, the expression of a man who has suspected something and found it confirmed. He asked whether it had caused trouble. She said she did not know, but that the clause in question had never been invoked. He nodded slowly. He said she had a good eye. It was not praise offered to reassure. It was an observation, plain and considered, and she received it as such. When the bell in the east corridor sounded the close of the working hour, they gathered the papers back into their respective order. Elara wrapped her notes and set her pen to rest. She moved toward the door, thinking of the cold passage beyond and the small supper Marta would have left near the fire. She had nearly reached the door when she heard him rise behind her. She did not quicken her pace. He reached the door a half-step before her and held it open, not with ceremony, not with the performance of a courtesy that the court sometimes made of such gestures, but quietly, as a man holds a door when another person is close behind. She passed through. She did not remark on it, neither did he, but she noted it, that small and deliberate thing, and carried it down the cold corridor with her like a candle she had not expected to be given. The reception hall had been arranged with particular care that evening. Extra candles burned along the gilt cornices, and the footmen wore their formal livery, the silver buttons freshly polished. It was the kind of room that declared its intentions before a single word was spoken. Elara stood near the east window, her translation notes folded small in her palm, and understood at once what the evening meant. The Lord Chamberlain had announced it quietly to the senior staff that morning. 3 names, 3 families of sufficient standing. The king had grown patient long enough. Prince Aldrich required a wife, and the court intended to provide one before the summer roses opened in the east garden. Lady Vanthorpe entered on the arm of her cousin and moved through the candlelight as though the room had been arranged specifically around her. She wore deep garnet silk, and she knew exactly where to stand. There was no cruelty in her manner that evening, Elara observed. There was something more settled than cruelty. There was certainty. The second candidate, Lady Mireille of the Northern Provinces, was fair and soft-spoken, and clearly terrified, which Elara found easier to bear than confidence. The third, Lady Cressida, laughed too readily at things that were not amusing, and the court laughed with her, because that is what courts do. Elara was not introduced to any of them. She was not expected to be. She was the translator, positioned near the Valdennian ambassador and his 2 attachés, her purpose precise and unremarkable. One of the attachés, a young man named Fenwick, had a pleasant face and very little of consequence to say, and it fell to Elara to render his pleasantries into something approaching diplomacy. She did so without difficulty. It was, in its way, restful work, the kind that required her mouth and freed her mind entirely. She watched the prince from across the room. He stood where ceremony required him to stand, near the great marble hearth, and he received his 3 candidates with the same measured courtesy he brought to everything. He was not unkind. He was not cold precisely. He was absent. That was the word that settled in her mind as she murmured a translation of Fenwick's remarks about the mild winter. Aldrich wore his obligations the way one wears a coat that belonged to someone else, correctly fitted, but not one's own. He smiled when smiling was asked of him. He inclined his head with appropriate gravity, and yet there was something behind his eyes that had not been invited to the reception and was not enjoying itself now. Lady Vanthorpe touched his sleeve at one point, a gesture so light it might have been accidental. It was not accidental. Aldrich did not move away. He also did not lean toward her. He remained precisely as he had been, attentive and elsewhere. Elara looked back at Fenwick, who was asking, through her, whether the Valdennian trade agreement might be extended. She translated the question carefully. Then a movement at the periphery of her attention made her glance up. Aldrich was looking at her, not toward her general direction, at her. It lasted perhaps 3 heartbeats, long enough for something unguarded to cross his face, something that had nothing to do with garnet silk or silver buttons or the formal occasion that surrounded them both. Then a courtier touched his arm and he returned to his duties, and the moment closed over like water. Elara returned to Fenwick. She heard a voice at her elbow, Lord Ashby, an elderly gentleman of the court, who smelled of cedar and had the manner of someone perpetually sharing confidential information with the furniture. He spoke in a low, satisfied tone. "The prince will have chosen by midsummer, I should think. The king will not wait longer." Elara said nothing. She folded her translation notes along their existing creases and tucked them neatly into her sleeve, where they settled against her wrist like a small, kept secret. A sensible match with Vanthorpe would settle the whole business, Lord Ashby added, to no one in particular. Elara agreed with him in the way one agrees with weather. It was present, it was probably accurate, and there was nothing useful to say about it. Across the room, the candles burned steadily. Lady Vanthorpe laughed at something the king had said, and the sound carried beautifully, as she had no doubt intended. The prince smiled. Outside the tall windows, the frost-rimed garden held its silence, and the evening moved on without hurry toward its already decided end. The letter to the Valdennian Academy of Letters arrived on Elara's desk at 9:30 in the morning. It required, the prince explained, a translator's eye for certain phrases in the body of the text, phrases that carried technical weight and might embarrass the crown if rendered carelessly. He set the document beside her inkwell with a quiet courtesy and asked whether she might spare an hour to consult the map in the orangery, where the relevant place names could be checked against the northern charts. Elara read the letter in under 2 minutes. The phrases he named were not difficult. She was quite certain he knew this. She set down her pen, straightened her dove-grey wool, and followed him to the east wing without remark. Some pretexts are thin enough to see through cleanly, and the kindest answer is to walk through them as though they were simply a door. The east garden received them in its winter silence. Gravel crunched beneath their boots, sharp, deliberate, each footfall distinct in the cold air. The rose briars had been tied back against the stone wall for the season. Their bare canes lashed in careful rows, like a kind of patient writing, brown and thorned, and waiting for what spring would eventually require of them. Copper ivy, still clinging where the stone offered purchase, had bronzed overnight to a colour that was almost warm, though nothing else in the garden was. Their breath rose between them in small pale clouds and dissolved. The frost had thickened on the gravel's edge and on the flat tops of the low hedges, and the whole garden held the particular stillness of a thing that has learned to endure. Elara did not speak, neither did he. There was, she found, no pressure in the silence. It was simply the garden, and the cold, and the sound of their walking. The orangery was small by the standards of the house, 4 braziers burning low, the glass above them pearled with condensation on the inner face, the world outside rendered soft and approximate through it. In the centre of the room, on a plain wooden table, lay the map of the northern provinces of Valdennia, its edges weighted with smooth river stones. To the left of the table stood a small lemon tree in a terracotta pot, its fruit still green, its blossoms long finished, its leaves a living, obstinate green that had no business being so vivid in December. Elara went to the map first, as was natural, and traced the northern border with one gloved finger, while the prince moved to the far end to consult the legend. After a suitable interval, long enough to seem purposeful, brief enough to be honest, he asked, without looking up from the map, whether she found the court honest. Elara considered the question the way she considered most things, as though it deserved the precision it was owed. She said she found the court accurate about what it values. He looked up then. He studied her face for a moment in the way he had, steady, unhurried, as though reading a text he intended to understand rather than merely finish. He did not smile, but something in his expression acknowledged the answer as exact. They moved around the table. He stopped near the far wall where the frost had found a crack in the seal and left a fine white line along the edge of the glass. Beside the wall stood the frost-thickened stone bench that was kept inside the orangery in winter, too heavy to move each season and too cold to sit upon now. He stopped beside it and turned to face her fully. "And what do you value, Miss Voss?" The question was not rhetorical. She understood immediately that it was not. He stood quite still. He waited. The braziers ticked. The lemon tree did not move. Elara set her hands together in front of her, a composure that was not performance but simply her natural posture when she was thinking precisely. She named 3 things. She named them plainly, without apology, and without particular emphasis, as a person states what is true when they have decided there is no particular advantage in concealing it. She said she valued work that is true, not flattering, not approximate, but rigorously what it actually is. She said she valued a room warm enough to think in, which was not, she thought, an unreasonable thing to require. And she said she valued not being required to pretend she is less than she is. She said it without bitterness. She said it as a preference, as one might state a preference for one translation over another, on the grounds of accuracy alone. He heard all 3 without interrupting. He did not fill the silence that followed with reassurance or qualification. He simply remained where he was, near the stone bench, and listened with the whole of his attention in the manner of a man who has learned, perhaps at some cost, that listening fully is not a passive act. The cold between them had changed. It was still cold. The braziers were still burning low, the frost was still against the glass, the lemon tree was still its impossible green. But the quality of the air between them was different by the time they turned back toward the door, quieter, somehow, in a way that had nothing to do with sound. They walked back through the winter garden without speaking. The gravel crunched as before, their breath still rose and dissolved. The rose-briars were still patient against the stone, and the morning, which had begun as an ordinary morning, had become something it could not now be made to unbecome. Lady Vanthorpe came into the cold archive on a morning errand. She wanted, she said, a map of the old eastern roads. Her gloves were pale, her ivory fan folded at her wrist. She moved among the shelves as though she owned the silence. Elara rose and offered to fetch the maps herself, but the lady waved her down with one smooth hand. Her eyes, meanwhile, travelled slowly across the table. There lay the Valdennian poetry volume, its cover worn soft with age. The prince's pencilled question mark was plain in the margin. A single word beneath it had been underlined twice. Lady Vanthorpe read it without bending, without touching the page. She let her gaze rest there for one quiet moment. The pencil was the prince's. Of that she felt quite certain. The word beneath was tender, and it was meant. Here was a thread, fine and bright, to be pulled. Then she smiled, thanked Elara kindly, and asked nothing more. She closed her fan and gathered her pale skirts. She took the map and the knowledge away together. The book she never touched at all. She did not need to. By evening she carried the matter into the blue salon. The court had gathered there for cards and idle talk. She arranged her account the way one arranges flowers. The translator's daughter, she observed, kept curious company of late. The prince, it seemed, left books upon her humble table. Books with his own hand marked inside the margins. She gave only facts and let the rest unfold. "I make no judgment," she said, fanning herself slowly. "I merely find it touching, how a clever girl finds friends." A ripple of laughter moved through the listening circle. "Such devotion to her work," she added, "and to her readers." She named no scandal. She required none to be named. The court's own imagination did the labour for her. One lady leaned close to another and murmured behind her hand. The murmur passed along the chairs like a small wind. Lady Vanthorpe watched it travel and said no more. She rose satisfied and let the whispers carry on without her. Word reached Elara through Marta late the following day. The old seamstress came and sat beside her in the workroom. She said nothing at first. She only folded her worn hands. Neither of them wept. The lamp burned low between them. At last Marta spoke, plainly, as she always did. "They are saying things, child, in the salons about you." Elara kept her eyes upon the thread before her. "I know," she answered. "I felt it coming this morning." Marta reached across and took her hand a moment. Then she released it, the way one releases a small bird. "You have done nothing," the old woman said. "I know that too." Elara nodded slowly. "Knowing it does not seem to help," she said. "It will pass," Marta told her. "Such talk always passes." "Perhaps," Elara answered, "but it leaves a mark behind." The old seamstress had no easy comfort to give, so she gave none and stayed, which was better. They sat together until the light failed in the window. The summons came the next morning, written and precise. The Lord Chamberlain received her in the panelled room. It smelled of beeswax and old wool and quiet authority. He was a man of 60, exact in every gesture. He bade her sit and folded his hands upon the table. "I am told," he began, "of a particular relationship." He chose the words with the care of a careful man. "Between yourself and His Highness, I should like it explained." Elara folded her own hands and met his gaze. She did not flush. She did not look away. "I work in the archive," she said. "He came to study. He asked questions about the old texts. I answered them. He left a book of poetry upon my table. I read it. I return to my work. That is the whole of it," she said. "There is nothing further to explain." The Chamberlain studied her, seeking the crack that would not come. "There are those," he said, "who read more into less." "I am aware of that," she answered him gently. He waited, as men of his office learn to wait. Elara let the silence sit, then spoke at last. "I have received a book," she said quietly. "I have done my work. Nothing more than that. If that is a scandal," she went on softly, then I cannot help the court's imagination. The chamberlain looked at her for a long while. He had questioned bolder souls and broken them. Her composure was a thing he could not place. He found, in the end, that he had nothing further. He thanked her stiffly and let her go. Elara returned through the corridors to the cold archive. The evening light lay gold across the silent shelves. She took up her own pen and bent again to her work. Outside, the great palace settled slowly into its quiet evening dark. The equerry delivered the news with the careful neutrality of a man who understood his prince. He stood very still in the doorway, hat in his hands, and spoke without embellishment. There had been talk, he said, the sort of talk that moved quickly through corridors, that required no evidence and asked for none. He named no names, for names were unnecessary. The prince thanked him and dismissed him with a word. The stillness that remained in the room afterward was more telling than any anger could have been. A man who shouts has already lost something. Aldrich had not lost anything yet. He intended to keep it that way. He did not summon her. That was the first and most deliberate choice he made. He had summoned witnesses to treaties and ministers to councils and physicians to bedsides, and all of them had come to him across cold marble floors with their faces arranged into the expected deferences. He did not want that now. He put on no particular coat for the errand. He walked through the eastern passage himself without announcement and arrived at her antechamber door while the frost was still white on the garden beyond the narrow window at the corridor's end. The door was ajar. He raised his hand to knock and heard the quiet scratch of a pen. He knocked once. The scratching did not stop immediately. It finished its word. He knew the pause of a person completing a thought before answering. And then she said, "Come in." She did not rise immediately when she saw who it was. The book lay open before her, the pen still in her hand, and a half-translated line crossed the upper margin in her small, deliberate script. It was a small breach of protocol. He did not remark on it. The antechamber was cold, as it always was. A single candle stood near the ink, tilted slightly where the brass holder had been bent and never repaired. He noticed these things in the way he had always noticed things, quietly, permanently, without making use of them. She set the pen down at last and waited. He did not make her wait long. "They will not make me ashamed of a book of poetry, Miss Voss," he said. She looked at him with an expression that was not surprise. It was something more considered than that. "I was not asking you to be," she said. There was a pause between them. The candle moved. Outside, a branch shifted against the stone in the wind. "I know," he said. He moved to stand near the window, not near her desk, which she had not invited him to approach. The frost was elaborate on the lower pane. Someone had not sealed it properly for winter, and the cold came through at the edges in the particular way of old palaces, which were always warmer in memory than in fact. He told her what he intended. He would go before the council. He would confirm her position clearly and without equivocation. He would say that her work had been exemplary and her conduct beyond reproach, and he would say it in the language of formal record, so that it could not be quietly unmade afterward. She listened without interrupting. When he had finished, she was quiet for a moment. Then she said, "I would ask you not to do it for my sake alone." There was a stiffness in how she held herself when she said it, not coldness, and something older than coldness, the dignity of a person who has never been able to afford the luxury of being rescued and has made a private arrangement with that fact. He looked at her. He did not move to argue the point or diminish it. He understood it as he understood most things she said, not immediately, not on the surface, but the way a person understands a foreign word they have seen used in enough contexts to feel its weight. "I hear you," he said, "and I ask you to hear this. What I intend because it is right. Your sake and rightness have arrived at the same place. I will not pretend otherwise to spare your pride, and I ask you not to pretend you are indifferent to the outcome to spare mine." She was still for a moment longer. The candle threw its small, unsteady light between them. Then, very quietly, she said, "That is fair." He nodded once. Outside, the frost held the garden in its patient, impersonal keeping. The cold made no distinctions, but inside that plain and underfurnished room, something had shifted in the way that quiet things shift. Without announcement, without fanfare, simply and entirely, the way a season finally concedes to the next. The council chamber held a cold that stone remembers long after fire has gone. Candles burned low in their iron stands, and the smoke of them drifted sideways through the draught that came beneath the door. The long oak table was set with water and wax and the formal documents of succession. At its centre, on a cushion of midnight velvet, sat the ancestral signet ring. It was not a large thing. The gold had worn thin at the shank from centuries of princes who had carried it before. But every man in that chamber knew what it meant, and every eye returned to it, as eyes will return to anything that holds the weight of consequence. The king sat at the table's head. He did not look at the ring. He looked at his son. The councillors arranged themselves in their seats with the careful precision of men who understood that history was about to be made and who wished to be correctly positioned when it was. The tall windows gave no warmth. The pale light of a winter morning pressed against the glass and came no further. Lady Vanthorpe was shown to her place by the chamberlain himself. She moved as she always moved, with the deliberate grace of a woman who has rehearsed every room she has ever entered. Her gown was ivory and gold, the colours of a woman who expects to be chosen. She settled into her chair and folded her hands before her on the table, and her expression was composed and still and entirely unreadable. Prince Aldrich took his seat without ceremony. He did not look at Lady Vanthorpe. He did not look at the ring. He folded his hands in his lap and fixed his gaze on some middle distance that belonged only to him. There was no agitation in his face, no restlessness in his bearing. Those who watched him closely might have said he looked like a man who had already made his peace with something and was waiting only for the world to catch up. The king rose. He spoke the old formal words, the ones that had not changed in 4 generations of this family. He spoke of duty and of line, and of the particular tenderness the crown owes to its own continuation. His voice was measured. He was not an unkind man. When the words were finished, he looked at his son and said simply that it was time. He gestured toward the velvet cushion, toward the worn gold circle resting there. The silence that followed was not brief. It stretched itself across the chamber and occupied every corner of it. A candle guttered. One of the older councillors cleared his throat and was still. Aldrich looked at the ring for a long moment. Then he looked at his father. He said that he could not place it. He said that a man ought not to reach for a thing his mind has already given elsewhere, and that to do so would be a discourtesy to everyone present, most particularly to the lady herself. The murmur that moved through the room then was not loud, but it was thorough. Councillors leaned toward one another. Papers were shuffled without purpose. The Chamberlain rose and spoke a few careful words about procedure and the appropriate channels for such a communication, and his voice had the particular quality of a man managing a situation he had not been told to prepare for. He managed it well. He always did. Lady Vanthorpe did not move for a moment, then something crossed her face, a small thing, quickly gone. A tightening at the corner of her mouth, her chin lifted a fraction of an inch, and then descended again. Her fingers, folded neatly before her, pressed together once and released. She drew one slow breath. By the time the Chamberlain had finished speaking, her expression had returned to precisely what it had been before, and she sat as she had sat, ivory and gold, composed and still, as though nothing at all had occurred that she had not expected. The king requested a brief recess. He and Aldrich withdrew to the cold side passage that ran behind the council chamber, where the stone was darkest and the draught from the courtyard came in under the arch. The king did not raise his voice. He said, quietly, that elsewhere was a particular kind of word, and that he wished to understand what his son meant by it. Aldrich said that elsewhere meant the woman he respected above every person in that palace. The king was silent. He turned the thought over carefully, the way a man turns a coin in his fingers when he is deciding something he has not yet decided. He asked whether the prince had considered what he was setting aside. Aldrich said that he had considered nothing else for some time. The king looked at his son for a long moment in the cold passage, the candle smoke threading faintly between them. He said nothing further. He turned and walked back toward the chamber, and Aldrich followed him, and the door closed softly behind them both, and the worn gold ring waited still on its cushion of midnight velvet, untouched and patient as grief. The antechamber was cold in the manner of rooms that have been patient a very long time. A single candle stood on the writing table, burned to within a finger's breadth of its base, and by its wavering light Elara Voss bent over a page of Valdennian verse, her pen moving in small, careful corrections. She had taken off her outer wrap to keep the wool from the ink. The cold had settled into her shoulders without her noticing, as cold will do when the mind is elsewhere. She did not hear the door at first. Then she did. Prince Aldrich stood in the frame, still dressed as he had been for the council, though the formal chain at his collar was gone. He looked, she thought, like a man who had set something heavy down and was not yet certain he had set it down correctly. She rose. She did not speak, because nothing in her years at court had prepared her with a sentence for this particular moment. He crossed the room in 4 steps, and stopped at a distance she would have called respectful, or perhaps careful. The candle shivered between them. He said, without preamble, what he had said to the king and to the assembled councillors. He said it quietly, as a man states a thing he has thought over for a considerable season, and is no longer afraid of. She listened. Somewhere in the telling her hand found the edge of the table and rested there. When he finished, she set her pen down very carefully, aligning it with the margin of the page. The small sound it made against the wood was the only sound in the room. She looked at him for a long moment. Then she said, in the voice she used when a translation did not yet make sense to her. Why? Not unkindly. Not as a woman deflecting a compliment, as a woman who had learned over 23 years of being found decorative or useful or overlooked. That easy elevation was among the more dangerous gifts a court could offer. He did not hesitate. "Because you answered my question in the garden honestly," he said, "because you did not pretend to be less than you are to make me comfortable, because I have not been able to read a Valdennian word since October without thinking of you." October. She had not known about October. She had known about the dictionary and the poetry book and the afternoons in the archive when the light fell at a particular angle through the high windows, and he had read aloud once, testing a pronunciation, and she had corrected him without thinking, and he had laughed very quietly, as though he had been waiting for someone to correct him for a long time. She had known about all of that. She had not known he had been carrying October as well. She looked at the candle. It had perhaps a quarter hour left in it. The wax had pooled and was beginning to run. She thought of her father, who had spent 30 years giving names to things in a language no one else at court bothered to learn, and who had told her once that the most precise translation was worth more than 100 approximate ones. She thought of the word velundra, and how it did not travel easily into other tongues because it required the speaker to acknowledge the longing as a thing already present, already shaping the room it inhabited. She was quiet for what felt to her like a very long time. Then she said, "I need you to understand that I will not become smaller for the court's convenience. Not now. Not even after." The candle moved. His expression did not. "I am counting on it," he said. It was not a grand declaration. It was not the kind of sentence that resolves itself cleanly into relief. It was the sentence of a man who had spent 2 years in a house full of quiet rooms and had decided, with some deliberateness, to unlock one of them. She felt the cold in her shoulders again, as though it had only just remembered it was there. Outside, the east garden would be deep in frost, the orangery glass whitened along its lower panes. The palace had been holding its breath, she thought, in the manner of old houses that have watched enough seasons to know when something is shifting. She did not yet believe it entirely. She thought she might require the morning and perhaps the morning after that, but she did not disbelieve it either, and that, for a woman who had learned to be precise about such distances, was itself a kind of beginning. The chapel held only a handful of witnesses on the morning of the betrothal. Pale winter light fell through the high windows and lay across the stone floor in long, quiet bars. Martha stood near the back, already weeping before the ceremony began, making no effort whatsoever to conceal it. She pressed a folded cloth to her cheek and lifted her chin with the dignity of a woman who has earned the right to feel things openly. Elara, standing at the altar in the best of her grey wool gowns, caught sight of her and felt something loosen in her chest, some knot she had carried so long she had ceased to notice its weight. The king stood to one side, solemn and brief. He had never been a man of ceremony for ceremony's sake, and the plainness of the room seemed to suit him as much as it suited Elara. Aldrich stood beside her. He was not nervous. He was simply present in the way she had come to associate with him, fully there, attending to her as though nothing outside the chapel walls required his consideration. When he took her hand and drew the ancestral signet ring from its cloth, she felt the cool weight of it settle against her finger and then slide gently too far. It was large for her, made for another generation's hand, broad and certain. She curled her finger beneath it at once, instinctively, to keep it from falling. He noticed. He looked down at her hand, then up at her. "I will have it fitted," he said quietly, as though it were a promise of something larger than the ring itself. "There is no hurry," she said. "I am keeping it." And then, because his expression was so careful and so earnest, because Marta was still weeping at the back of the chapel, and the morning light was very still, she laughed. It was not a polished laugh, it was brief and genuine, surprised out of her, and it changed her face entirely. He looked at her as though he were memorizing the sound of it. The weeks that followed settled into a new shape, quieter than she had expected. The court did not disappear. The corridors were still full of the usual industry, the usual small negotiations of rank and precedent. But something in her position had altered, not in the dramatic fashion of stories, but in the modest, practical way that actual things alter. Doors were held open, greetings were offered first. She moved through the palace differently, not because she wished to be seen differently, but because she no longer kept her eyes downward as a matter of habit. On a morning in early spring, they walked the east garden together, she and Aldrich, following the gravel path they had first walked in the season's coldest weeks. The frost was entirely gone. At the edges of the path where gravel met earth, the first green had begun, small and tentative, the colour of beginning. The trees still held the memory of winter in their bare upper branches, but the air had changed. She could feel it. They walked without urgency, which was their custom now. "What is the Valdennian word for belonging?" she asked. She had thought about asking for some time and had not, and now she simply did. He was quiet for a moment. He thought about it genuinely, the way he thought about most things, without performance, with honest consideration. "I believe," he said at last, "it is the same word as the one used for returning home." She turned this over. The gravel sounded softly under their steps. The ring sat on her finger, still slightly large, still curled against. "Then it is sufficient," she said. He did not reply, but she felt the quality of his silence, and it was agreement. Her desk was where it had always been, the same corner of the antechamber, the same wide surface worn smooth along one edge, her father's Valdennian dictionary set at its familiar angle. She sat there that evening as the palace moved toward quiet. The dictionary was open. The work continued. It always did, and she was glad of that. But the room was different in two ways now. A fire burned in the small grate to her left, properly laid, properly tended, casting steady warmth across the stone floor and the edge of her gown. And the door to the corridor stood open. Not ajar. Open. The sounds of the palace drifted in, footsteps at a distance, a low exchange of voices, the ordinary breath of a house that had begun at last to include her. She dipped her pen, the ring held, the fire held. Outside, in the east garden, the green was still coming in at the edges, patient and unhurried, as all true things are.